Roy, we were talking earlier in the show about battles over corporate control of Indian land. You recently published a long essay about your travels with the Maoist insurgency. And in it you argue that rather than being India's gravest internal security threat, as your Prime Minister has argued, that the Maoist insurgency is about indigenous people trying to protect their land from corporate takeover. This is not an analysis which is widely reported. You've been on the inside and the outside of this movement, and you've been studying it for years. What have you learned?
Well, first of all, I mean, the first question would be the use of the word Maoist insurgency, because actually what the Maoist movement in India has had several avatars, but basically the first uprising was in 1967 in West Bengal in a village called Naxalbari.
Which is why they call it the Naxalite movement.
The Naxalites, yeah. Mm-hmm. But always at the center of the Naxalite movement have been tribal people, indigenous people, who have a history of resistance and rebellion that predates Mao by a few centuries. But why did they suddenly become an internal security threat? Because in 2005, a few things happened simultaneously. One is, if you look at a map of India, the forests, the tribals, the minerals, and the Maoists are all stacked up on top of each other. And in 2005, the government signed MOUs, that's memorandums of understanding, worth billions of dollars with mining corporations. Just the bauxite in Orissa is worth $2 trillion.
Wow.
The iron ore is something like that. Just then these MOUs were signed. The stocks of the mining companies soared. Just that year, just 2 weeks into the signing of two of the biggest of these MOUs, the Salva Judum, which is a kind of tribal people's militia, was let loose. And it went through the forest, burning villages, killing and raping people. And this was a policy of what is called strategic hamleting. You know it from Vietnam.
This is from the Vietnam era.
That's right. The two big MOUs in this district called Bastar were signed in April and May 2005. And in June, this government-sponsored people's militia was let loose on something like 640 villages. And it went through these villages, burning them down, killing people, raping women, and forcing people to move into police camps. Some went voluntarily and some didn't. So about 50,000 people moved into the camps, and about 300,000 people went off the government radar. Some of them, of course, went away to work in other states. Many are still hiding in the forests, afraid to come to their villages, impossible to go to the market.
Many of these people are not necessarily part of the Maoist movement.
Many are not, but many are,
I guess they're becoming. Is that what you're suggesting?
That the Salva Judum didn't work. It backfired, and more people became part of the Maoist movement. So now they've announced a full-scale war, which is called Operation Green Hunt, where something like 70,000 paramilitary troops are closing in on the indigenous people of this country.
So having been inside and living with the people in this movement that you've been writing about for years from the outside, how do you compare the portrait that we're offered in the official story and what you witnessed living among those people?
See, what I think has happened, which is very terrifying, and I think even scholars who have studied this kind of thing before have said, is that when a population of people is being prepared to be wiped off the map, not as in put into concentration camps and shot or gassed, but this is a population that is not a consumer population. It's what the Germans used to call überzahligen Essern, I think, which means superfluous eaters. They are not required. So it's important to make them, either to demonize them or to make them completely faceless, so that when you slaughter them or when you lay siege to them and they're already starving and malnutritioned, when they disappear, you don't notice. So that the rest of the population can live with their consciences clear. So that's what's going on, that they are trying to dehumanize them in a way, to make it impossible, because it's true that the Maoists' rhetoric can be quite ugly, and they do say very openly they want to overthrow the state.
And there are bodies piling up on both sides.
Well, the bodies piling up on one side and the other you cannot compare, for one. But the second thing is that, because, I just want to say two things. One is, I've been in that forest at night. What do you do when 1,000 policemen come and surround a forest village? Do you go on a hunger strike? Or what do you do? You have to fight back. And then they say, oh, they killed the policeman. Isn't it terrible? But
well, this is the country that gave the world the Gandhian ethos.
The Gandhian ethos is a very frightening ethos in the forest, because the Gandhian ethos requires, it's performance that requires an audience. And in the forest, there's no audience. In a society that doesn't belong to the rest of society, how do hungry people go on a hunger strike? How do people who have no money not pay their taxes or do civil disobedience? No one cares. No one's watching, I think it's really important to understand that the Maoist movement and this tribal uprising is not able to function outside of the forest, And there are other kinds of resistance that are happening. So it's not the only resistance in India. There's a huge bandwidth of resistance, all of which the government is calling Maoist, and killing people whether they are Maoist or not Maoist,
Do you see parallels here with the Taliban, where anyone who is resisting a kind of occupation is labeled with one label when there are clearly many movements?
If you look at what's happening in that part of Asia, from Afghanistan to Waziristan, to the northwest frontier provinces, to the northeastern states of India, to this entire so-called Red Corridor. It's all tribal areas. It's a tribal uprising. And of course, in Afghanistan, it takes the form of an ugly radical Islam. And here, it's an extreme left uprising. But the attack is a corporate attack on tribal homelands. And so they are fighting a kind of occupation, even within India,